All right, guys, how's it going? We got Melody here, YouTuber, and makes videos about essentially just random literature. Yeah, on your YouTube channel.
So mostly my channel focuses on history and political theory, and sometimes current events from a kind of a Marxist standpoint, Marxist perspective.
Gotcha.
I call it Marxism-Leninism, but somebody's probably going to say, "Oh no, you're a liberal revisionist,"
Yeah, that's
whatever.
that's typically the tone that happens
I,
when you.
I read a lot of Marx. I'm deeply influenced by the Leninist tradition, Mao, and so on. So and the Panthers, the Black Panthers, that sort of Black radical tradition. That's something I draw on
Gotcha.
principally. Uh,
Okay, yeah, no, cool. I definitely wanted to before we really start getting into, the core of like theory and physics. I wanted to give your channel a shout out. I apologize on my end. This happens when I have people on who are, like I was saying before, I don't watch enough content, especially content creators that come on sometimes. So I apologize. I haven't really seen much. But I promise to do that in the future. I definitely wanted to give a little bit of a shout out and direct people to your channel, though.
yeah, I appreciate that, and you're quite a bit more reach than I do. I think you have literally about 10 times more
Oh,
subscribers than I do.
yeah. Well, physics and theory, this has definitely been something that I know my audience and I have talked about quite a bit, or at least was curious. We couldn't really talk much about physics because I don't think a lot of people within my audience know too much about physics, but it's something where I think the overlap could get extremely interesting. So I think sort of like the first thing that I would ask is for someone who is interested in theory, coming from mainly a theoretical background, how would you essentially introduce them into physics, maybe with that sort of theoretical mindset in mind?
Yeah, so I guess trying to think of it as somebody who came the other way, somebody who was trained in the natural sciences and came into theory and philosophy kind of from the outside, trying to think of it dialectically. What would it be like for somebody from theory and philosophy to come into physics and mathematics? Which is to say, I would advise coming at it from the perspective of, well, what we're looking at is ontology, right? Or something, whatever closest approximation thereof we can come to with uh, our ability to sense and perceive the world. Um, so we are, I would say, contemporary physics and the natural sciences more broadly is, a very kind of, I advise looking at it as a sub branch of philosophy, right? It's the
Mhm.
part of philosophy dealing with uh, what is, right? Ontology.
Okay, yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. That's sort of what I was wondering, where like immediately the thing that struck me, especially about like sort of maybe if I can consider this, maybe my terminology might be wrong, but later quantum physics is that I feel like whenever it comes to that, again, I'm no physicist. I've read like one book on on like quantum physics, but
Most physicists don't understand quantum mechanics either.
yeah. It seems like that, but it seems like potentially there's a whole realm of like potential like metaphysics there, and sort of like a new development of ontology that um could be answered, and I think it would
Very
be
famously.
wise. Sorry,
Oh,
what's up?
sorry.
No, yeah.
Richard, yeah, Richard Feynman very famously, or I don't know, it's probably an apocryphal quote, but it sounds like something he would say, which is, uh, the first thing you need to understand about quantum mechanics is that nobody understands anything about.
No one. Sorry, I think you cut out. No one understands anything about quantum mechanics.
Yeah, Feynman, who was incidentally a pioneer of quantum mechanics and many other discoveries. But he said the first thing you need to understand about quantum mechanics is that nobody understands quantum mechanics.
Gotcha. That sort of makes sense, honestly. Well, I was, probably just to make sense, add some clarity. What would you put in sort of like the most base abstract mode? Like, what is quantum mechanics? Essentially, like I know you can't sum that up completely, but
Sure.
in a footnote sort of way.
Right. But to the layperson, quantum mechanics is the study of physics at the subatomic level. We're talking about things, not atoms, but the things that are inside atoms. The uh, world, the universe at its most fundamental levels, or at least what we can conceive of as its most fundamental levels, the thing that we have come to understand as its most fundamental levels thus far. Um, what the word quantum means, like quantum as in quantity, we are talking about things that are uh, stepwise. So, like a quantum leap, for example, is when a electron becomes energized and it goes to its next level of excitement. And
Gotcha.
it is what the quantum in quantum mechanics means. There's no in between. The electron is either in this state or that state. It's either at its lowest level of excitation or it's at its next level. There's no transition. It's either one or the other. That's the quantum in quantum mechanics. The quantum refers to the fact that energy and space are not, as in what the term in mathematics is, they're not real in terms of they're not infinitely divisible. Like you can, in mathematics, for example, with real numbers, capital R, real, you can keep dividing them infinitely. You can take one and you can divide it by two, you can divide it by three, you can divide by four, and so on, right?
Right.
But the quantum universe doesn't work that way. There is a fundamental limit to the minimum quantities of space and energy and lots of other things. When you get down to that submolecular level, the universe, I guess to put it in kind of lay terms, the universe has a pixel density, right? It's not infinitely divisible. There's sort of a minimum size that things take up, and that's what is meant by quantum. That's the quantum and quantum mechanics.
Okay, so quantum essentially is to do with like an actual core minimum of size. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And I would say that if you want, and again, I don't want to get into explaining the minutia of this in too jargony of a way, because I want to keep things accessible. But the equation E equals h nu, which is energy is proportional to the constant h times the frequency nu of a particle of light. This is to say, the energy is proportion to how short the wavelengths are, the crests between the waves of light, right? But the h part, that's the critical part, which is to say that they only come in discrete quantities, which was one of Einstein's core discoveries.
Gotcha. Okay. Might be a little bit abstract for my idiotic brain, I suppose. But no, I guess that's probably better that's probably the best way I've heard it explained, to be honest, because I think that's any time like you hear about quantum mechanics. Again, it's sort of a joke. I think I may have mentioned this to you beforehand, but it's like a bunch of people, like it was in my Discord and on stream, we've talked about it. It's like I have no idea like about quantum mechanics. I have no idea about newer development of physics, but I feel like it's important. Like I don't know how to make sense of it, but it feels important.
And the thing that I like to emphasize as somebody who I view myself as an educator, and I'm trying to make things. What I want to do is demystify the natural sciences, because I think there's a lot of kind of woo, for lack of better word. There's quantum woo, right? You have all these like self-styled gurus, saying, "Oh, here, wear this crystal that aligns your chakras to the quantum realm or whatever." Like, they're snake oil salespeople, basically, right? They're using a few, pseudoscientific terms that maybe they come from quantum mechanics or something, but they're using it to basically just sell you bullshit.
So you said these are actual physicists who will do this?
Oh, no, not so much. I mean, I'm sure there's a couple of unscrupulous ones out there, but this is like, I mean, this is if you in the world of, so-called homeopathic medicine or
Oh, oh,
whatever, you'll have all kinds of people telling you to, align your energies with the universe or whatever.
right, right.
And I'm not trying to discount spirituality or anything like that, but there's people out there trying to sell you, like literally to sell you a bunch of bullshit. So
Well,
that's where,
isn't it
no,
kind of funny? I kind of get that with like philosophy in general. You tell people you're into philosophy, like, oh yeah, like I really like stuff like Buddhism, like Eastern. I'm like, and like, to be fair, like forms of Buddhism certainly can be seen as like a philosophy of religion and stuff like that. But I think there is such a distancing of what actual like a lot of like philosophy really is. Like most people still think of like philosophy as something like wildly esoteric and wildly like like healing
right.
crystals kind of stuff. And
Yeah,
there is
it's an obscure thing for nerdy academics to spend their days navel gazing themselves with, right? Or
yeah,
something like that.
100%. And it's there is some irony and humor in that. Yet is it's sort of like a damnation of the state of things, but like that's like ironically that's still one of the more important things we can do is exactly that. It's kind of the absurdity of things, but yeah.
Right. Well, and I was coming from it as a Marxist, right? I think that theoretical activity is underrated in the sense that you're just talking about. Um, but I think that it doesn't need to be directed. I don't believe in just us reading a bunch of theory for its own sake or as a intellectual exercise. Like I am a Marxist. I'm trying to learn about the world so that I can transform it. But I think that there's, especially kind of in the U.S., there's this very kind of overbearing anti-intellectual culture baked into kind of everything, even on the left.
Oh,
Um,
100%.
and I've talked about this with like Paul Morin. Folks are familiar with him. I did a
I
stream
do
with him.
know of all content creators that I don't know, I do know who Paul is though.
Yeah, so I was on his show talking about science and socialism and whatnot, and we were discussing how the anti-intellectualism is. I mean, we think of it as being a very, certainly in general would agree with that, but I do see it in, to a lesser degree, but I do see it in leftist organizing spaces and um, like I think there's kind of an important balance to get, because I think that, right, like there is this kind of default undervaluation of theoretical activity, but at the same time, right, like there are people who will just kind of you know take up a lot of air by bloviating about reification and blah blah blah, a bunch of jargony sounding theory terms,
Hmm.
yada yada. And so I think there is kind of there's a I think you have to be balanced in your approach. I think you have to know your audience. You have to know uh, what are you theorizing for? Are you theorizing to sound really smart and basically jerk yourself off, or are you trying to achieve some practical goal and connect with people in an organizational framework that will allow you to be effective and carry out your activities in the world? And that is ultimately where I come from in terms of what how I approach theory.
Right. And I think that's it's 150% the the best approach. No, but I going back to the sort of like stigma, even like a very I find I don't contend with other forms of ideology or like sort of political or philosophical groups other than the left. But I do see a huge issue with like not only like a lack of like a sort of intellectual approach to things, but a sort of antagonism against it. And I see one of the biggest things that I see, I'm sure you have too, is like people misconstrue like intellectualism or taking an intellectual approach to things as like elitism. And that's always
Yeah,
really, yeah.
yeah, Paul and I talked about this too. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really really confusing to me. And what I've seen personally is there's and especially once you really approach like sort of philosophy and theory, like I think really like you and Paul do. I'm sure that's a really easy it's really clear when you see it, because there's like like almost a split. I don't really think really much of anything's truly binary, but it's sort of like conceptually like a binary where you see people who are interested into more sort of frameworks of things, theoretical ideas, and then you see people who are sort of just interested in sort of like just the content of things. And I see these people are very drawn towards things just as like journalism. And journalism's great. Like I think that like we can't
Right, but
understate.
a narrow, static conception of it.
Right, exactly. Like we can't understate the importance of actual journalism, but what we see is I think there is such a lack of almost like a critical form of looking at things within this sort of, I want to say, like quasi journalistic framework. We see
Yeah,
things that like what happens is it turns into like punditry. And then it's like punditry that's not too critical of itself at the same time. Like
right.
it
It's a, as Du Bois said, it's a self-laudatory monologue.
it's 150%. And I've actually like and of course like Twitter isn't completely real life, although I try to when I try to make references to Twitter, I try to almost defend like, why I do that, because I think the digisphere as far as social media is becoming increasingly more real life as time goes on, and that's sort of kind of a bad thing in some ways. But I see on like Twitter a lot, there is a lot of like oh I like theory this and that, like this is just like, say, if you're taking a Marxist approach, workers can't understand this and that, and it's like I find that really really self-defeating. It's not supposed to be easy, but yeah.
Well, the other thing is, oh, workers can't understand. Well, bullshit. How many workers have you talked to
I,
lately? I talk, I literally, I work in a factory. I talk to my coworkers about this shit all the time. And, I'm not using all this, highfalutin 19th century terminology to talk about it. But, again, it's about knowing your audience, knowing theory and being able to apply it intelligently is not about being able to, literally quote capital, chapter and verse. It's about being able to say, hey, we're being fucked over by this system that exploits us in this way, and here, in doing this, you deploy the concepts that you learn through theoretical activity, but then it becomes, vivified when you actually are on the shop floor talking to your coworkers and, raising some hell, so to speak,
mhm,
right? I think that, people who think, oh, theory is elitist, or, and I understand why,
mhm.
right? I think it's an entirely unjustified assertion, but like people who will kind of beat you to death with that assertion, I think really haven't connected with it in a, or they've been exposed to it in a very limited way.
Right. And there's like I find too there's we find differing like intentions too, like and I think this is the thing, oddly enough theory can kind of help too, is like sort of try to explain it. So I still quite like psychoanalysis in a sociological sense, where it can sort of kind of explain sort of or help give context to sort of weird sociological patterns and behaviors. And like one of those big things is like subliminal like aesthetics, and like a sort of what's the best way to put this, sort of like a catharsis or a reinforcement of things. And I see that there's like there's such a pre-existing reinforcement against things such as like theory, that it's like, oh, it's mumbo jumbo because I can't understand it, or I in the labor process I work all the time, I don't have enough time, this is useless and stuff like that. And yeah,
And granted, a lot of it is pretty useless,
yeah, no,
but
yeah,
that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the useful stuff, so
right.
it's a little
Well,
of a moot point.
and well, and that no, that's absolutely true. But I even think that even the useless stuff is important to like sort of contend with in a way.
Right. To
Like
tarry with the negative.
exactly 150%.
Yeah.
I try, and also too, this goes into a little bit of a different segue, but nonetheless, something that I've always sort of abided by. I never have been able to give language to this sort of idea and approach that I've taken with philosophy and theory.
Hmm.
But like something that I guess plastic pills, I've been able to sort of like really like internalize is plastic pills made a video on Deleuze's book over Nietzsche, and his video was, whether or not I haven't read the book, I don't know if that's in the text, but the video was phenomenal, and he said something that kind of was like an aha moment. Like, I've always followed this rule, but I now have language for it. But it was that philosophers and theorists are sort of like you're mining for gold, and not everything that they're going to say is correct, and that's not the point, right? You sift out the sand and the dirt, and you pick out those gold pieces.
Right. And like Deleuze, when I think of Deleuze, I think of somebody who kind of self-professed approach was not to create a foundational theoretical um, edifice, but to create tools for your tool belt.
It, yes.
And Deleuze would have probably put it something like that. Now, granted, I haven't read a whole lot of Deleuze myself, but I find, from what I've been exposed to, kind of obliquely, I think how great is plastic pills? Oh my gosh,
Yeah.
love plastic pills. But yeah, I think right. Like I think there's, and this is what my kind of from somebody who's like educated in Marxism through like practical activity. I didn't come in through academia. I came through it through activism. So again, my what I kind of find that persists throughout kind of some more kind of orthodox Marxist organization and framework is that um, there's kind of an allergy to like, oh, you can't read Deleuze, Guattari,
Yes.
bourgeois nonsense, or it's
Hmm.
neoliberal or whatever. I think there's kind of this discursive frame that I think anybody who's on Twitter will immediately recognize what I'm talking about, which is, it's kind of like a discursive community finds a way to say thing bad and then
Yes.
and decide that that thing is bad, and now that's their in-group epithet for anything outside, right? Like, so
Right.
Marxists like to say, oh, that's liberal or that's bourgeois or whatever, and it'll be kind of maybe superficially attendant to things like what's the actual form and content of it, but I think in general it's just kind of like, oh, this is bad because I don't like it. And I think there's kind of like, to another illustrative tendency would be like among Marxists or among anarchists is just to call everything vaguely non-anarchist, call it liberal or call it tanky or
Yeah.
whatever. To pick your community and you'll find this
Right.
tendency.
That's sort of that's in a lot of ways it's actually why I don't like uh, so when I think about like say my personal use case, a lot of people are sort of confused. A lot of people will kind of claim that, and you know what, like that's fine, like if you want to. I don't think I'm radically attached to a sort of identity in this way, but a lot of people are like, dude, you're not a Marxist, and it's like, okay, some people say it threateningly, some people say it
Yeah.
like some people say it like some people say it what's the best way to put it, like just like
Just like
like descriptively, like, yeah, like you're probably not a Marxist, and that's fine. I consider myself at a sort of a sort of base political level like a Marxist, but absolutely there's some give and take there. I think naturally there always kind of should be, but that's another discussion, I suppose. But
Well,
regardless, yeah, I've
I
never.
think
Sorry.
yeah, sorry, yeah, no, I think that the discourse is like when somebody comes at you and says it that way, it's kind of like saying, yeah, I'm not a Catholic either.
Yeah,
You know,
and there's different forms of that. Some people are
right,
culturally Catholic, some people are like spiritually Catholic, in a
right,
very just yeah.
yeah, and I mean like I'm a Jew and I'm a Jew, like people, I mean I people ask soon as there's this kind of
I
Jewish.
apologize. I apologize, Melody. I think you're cutting out. Sometimes this happens on Discord. It can be like typically what it is
Far
it's
away
like
from my mic.
yeah, it's like input sensitivity is often sort of an issue.
I'm bringing myself a little. Is that better?
Yeah, I think so. It was just whenever you were getting towards the ends of your sentences, it was kind of cutting out.
Okay. I'll try to stay a little closer to my mic.
Sounds perfect now.
Right. So there's this old Jewish aphorism, which is that if you have two rabbis arguing in the same room, you have three opinions.
Yeah, no, 150%. And it's like we can talk about like whether that's like technically a good or a bad thing, quote unquote. But that's why I've really been super careful to kind of really like ingrain myself within any sort of internalized camp of Marxism. First, I find it really kind of like really like it's way too antagonistic by default. I think if anything, even through things like I want to say even like historical materialism, one of the sort of metaphysical points, if there is a sort of like very core metaphysical thing to historical materialism, in some ways I can see that. But if there is, there might be a subtext of like cooperation versus competition, and that like the division of labor at the most abstract sense is one of the things in the new labor process that Marx identified was that look, it separates people, it creates a very false, he uses this explicitly, like a false form of separation from your man. It pits man against man,
Right.
and
Separation of intellectual from physical labor,
mhm.
planning labor versus execution, and so on.
Exactly, and that's something that is when you get into the very hard like ideological cores of Marxism and the camps is like that is so apparent, and in my mind it's beyond. It's not only unnecessary, it's like it's just I don't know. I mean, again, the best way to put it is it's so insanely self-defeating. I don't know how. I don't think actually. I think maybe we can segue into this too, like
Mhm.
what to do about that sort of competitive divide. I've kind of
Right.
came to the point that the potential answers of that isn't going to purely exist within Marxism. And I can kind of elaborate on that. It's like I don't think we can solve that issue exactly by just
Yeah.
saying that there's a contradiction with what initially like Marx thought. I think for so long that's been true and Marx has already been established, and still we still have these weird
Sure.
groups of that are extremely sectarian.
Right.
I
Well,
actually like the Deleuzian sort of or Spinozian approach of sort of like um everything sort of is in a process of relationship, and that at the very core there should not be a sort of like artificial negativity, because I think
yeah.
Deleuze and Spinoza especially, they didn't really see a quote unquote negative. They sort of like someone like Hegel would talk about like the
Yeah.
negative and approaching the
Right.
negative.
Deleuze and that whole camp were very opposed to, like, oh, hey, the whole metaphor of the tree and
Yeah.
negation, and right, like we want to create space for multiplicity, positivity, right?
Exactly. And at the very surface, for people who aren't too into theory, they hear that, and that absolutely, I get it. That comes off as like really like academic-y, artsy sort of things. It really truly does. But like again, we've never a lot of these people have never read Deleuze or understand the frameworks in which they are operating in, and the ideas and the sort of history of philosophy that they're really contending with. And it's kind of on the outside it does come off that way, but I think that's kind of where I am, where it's like it truly, I think that the best thing we can do is build relationship, and at least acknowledge the immediate relationship within people, and in my mind that's sort of like that's something that lends itself to Marxism very well, if you ask me.
So yeah, so I have some real immediate thoughts on that, and most of them are coming from kind of my reading of the Marxist-Leninist Maoist tradition, and I don't explicitly identify with that, but definitely with the Marxist-Leninist part. But definitely, so there's this notion within MLM thought, which is that there is a kind of a tension, which I think you just very eloquently laid out, which is there's a tension between, on the one hand, eclecticism, which is to say just treating everything as kind of a unlimited buffet, a free for all, and then on the other side is dogmaticism, which is right. It's it's dialectical opposite, right? It's the
Mhm.
right the Marxism as a church, or anarchism as a church, or whatever, revolutionary or socialist politics as a church, and here are the tenets, and
Right.
you have to believe in X, Y, and Z, or you're not in the in group, right? These are part of a big, like those are it within the MLM framework. Those are a dialectical pair which are in tension, and there's no necessarily, like, the resolution isn't necessarily like, oh well, we need a little bit of both, but like it's to recognize that there is that tension there, and to be able to theorize and act within uh, a field that is kind of like situated in that spectrum, right? I don't know. Maybe I got off in
No, 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 no.
into
That
the
that makes sense. I've read a few different books about like sort of Marxism, Leninism, Maoism. Um,
Mhm.
I I think as far as like the core part of, I think Marxism's an extremely broad field. I know a lot of people say like no, Marxism's just revolutionary Marxism. Like if it's not revolutionary, it's not Marxism. I don't know if I'm quite there, but nonetheless, as far as maybe like a revolutionary Marxist framework, I do think it makes the most sense to sort of be in the camp of Marxism, Leninism, Maoism. I wouldn't consider myself an MLM probably,
I
but
could,
it makes the most immediate sense as far as like the core like idea of dialectics and stuff. One thing though that I have noticed that I wonder what you think too. If we're on the topic of Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, we've talked about this a little bit on the stream.
okay.
I almost don't think that Marxism, Leninism, Maoism is actually like different enough for Marxism, Leninism. If you ask me, like one of the biggest things is
You're
I
definitely, for the record, you're asking the wrong person, because I don't identify as an
oh okay.
MLM. I just personally, I've read a little bit of MLM literature, and a lot of the kind of organizations that I interact
Hmm.
with, such as For the People, um, are kind of in the MLM organizational milieu, and so that's kind of the angle I'm coming from. I'm not coming from it, like, again, a lot of my, and this is going to be a recurring theme throughout our conversation, a lot of my kind of theoretical activity is less to do with me sitting down in my room with Plato in one hand and
Yeah.
Marx on the other, and saying, dialectical this, that, and the other thing. It's from, again, for me as a Marxist who came into Marxism through my practical activity in struggle, is to say, I'm basing my theory on my experiences with the world. And yes, I'm reading books to supplement that. Yes, I'm theorizing to supplement that, but it is all in service of my own practical activity with my comrades in struggle in real life. And that's what I think kind of gets lost in a lot of conversation about this, is it gets treated as like, okay, we're doing theory, and theory is over here on the bookshelf in your bedroom or in the library or whatever, and praxis is out there.
Right.
Again, I think that uh, we need to be centering man's practical activity with him, anyhow.
Right, and that feels very explicitly like Mark. That seems like the absolute best approach as far
Right.
as like Marxism goes. And to be fair, like that's actually not where I approach things. I actually do approach things from a very theoretical distance, for better or worse, right? And that's a good, again
Yeah.
too. That's a good point where like I don't know if I'd like if I can comfortably say I'm completely a Marxist, because I think that is probably accurately speaking, when you actually read like theory, that seems to be like a really big underpinning that would probably qualify someone as a Marxist. That's something that I definitely take a pretty big distanced approach. I am the kind of weird person who I actually do approach theory actually from a distance, but I think it's actually really I think to have that sort of physical approach. I know quite a few people who have
Yeah.
gotten into theory precisely because they were involved with organizing, and
Yeah.
there are like major differences with how they approach things, and I actually think that's extremely useful in a lot of ways.
Mhm. Yeah. So, and I guess maybe that'll be, I don't believe, you'll hear it from me a million times. I don't believe in these spectacleized internet debates, but maybe that
Yeah.
can be kind of my conversation challenge to you, because I don't want to say debate. I'll say that's my challenge to you.
Challenge to which point?
Well, just in the sort of opposition that we just set up between people who come to the approach through activism versus theory as theory.
Oh,
Um,
no, I think what I meant was that there's a lot of people who are introduced into like theory from activism, and then there's some people introduced to like sort of activism from theory, if that makes sense.
okay, yeah. That's splitting hairs. My bad.
Oh, okay. No, no, no. I just didn't know if you like
Yeah,
misunderstood me or
no,
not.
yeah. It's just fine. I think we're. You're gonna have to excuse me for just a few moments.
Okay, yeah, no problem.
I'll be back in less than a minute.
Okay, no problem. All right. Okay, guys, how's it going? I'll actually let's interact with some chat. Let's do some chat stuff. Typically that's how these streams goes. Uh this stream in general sort of goes is it's actually like most of the time we do usually Q&A and sort of like interaction stuff. But um I actually like doing these. I like doing these quite a bit. It's sort of it's something different and we can get different approaches. But I think I'm thinking before we set this up, we were going to talk a little bit more about the relation of physics within like Engel's emergentist dialectics. I think we can probably get into that. We got into some sort of like theoretical discussions around, best approaches to stuff, best approaches to things like Marxism or how we conceptualize certain things. But yeah. Instagram introduced me to activism. I feel like that's something that's super like that's actually good. Like the consequence of that, it's actually good. But I feel like you get a lot of shit for saying that, man. Like, oh, you're an activist from Instagram. You're not a real activist, huh? Do a mukbang? Am I supposed to say that? I have no idea what that is. Am I? Is that? I have no idea what that means. Maybe I shouldn't have said that. I don't know. Let's discuss transgenderism. Common guys, this is lame. Is this bait? Okay. Um let's Yeah, feel free to come back, Melody, if you are back.
Yeah, I'm right here.
Gotcha. Okay, no problem. Perfect. I was actually just talking to chat for a little bit while you were gone. But, I think this would probably be a good place to go. So I read I will admit I didn't read I'm ADD brain hard, but I read most of the article that you sent me about Engel's emergentist dialectics.
Oh
Um
yeah, it was a great article.
yeah, and sort of the relation with I would say that's sort of like a sort of dialectical mechanistic way of viewing physics. Yeah, is that
Well, here's the thing, and this is kind of where I think that dialectics has some interesting, like, dialectics runs into. I mean, this is gonna sound like really like almost self-evident, but
Mhm.
dialectics itself runs into contradictions that it's not really prepared for.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
but but I think uh, you know Engels, especially in like dialectics of nature, I think touches on something that's essential to everything that we have in contemporary science, which is that nature is things in nature are interconnected. They aren't uh, atomized. They're not in these static categories. They're in constant states of coming into being and passing out of being. And um, right? Like even something that we regard as very permanent, like the proton, right? The proton is like the fundamental uh, building block of the atom, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we, people studying nuclear physics even now think that protons have a lifespan. They have a they have a they have a pull date, if you will. It's maybe trillions of years, trillions upon trillions of years. But there's some thought now that protons do actually eventually decay, uh, and so I think that the dialect that nature being dialectical, I think, is definitely a in terms of like the history of the philosophy of science is definitely a step up in terms of because the kind of the conception before is that everything that was is and will always be is the same stuff. It's
Mm-hmm.
always going to be right, and there are certain things that we understand like the conservation of energy and that sort of thing. We understand that those are constants as well as far as we know so far. Um, Again, I have to qualify everything with that as far as we know so far, as far as we know so far, as we know so far, and so on.
Sure.
But uh, but Engels in Dialectics of Nature really opens that up to understanding, and this was something that was very important to Einstein as well, which is that nature is full of interconnections and is in constant motion. To use an example from relativity theory, general relativity, which is, of course, Einstein's great
Mm-hmm.
contribution to science, which is it's actually not even a quote from Einstein. It's a quote from, I think, John Archibald Wheeler, who's another kind of disciple of Einstein. He said matter tells space-time how to curve. Sorry, what is it? Matter tells space-time how to curve. Space-time tells matter how to move. Which is that's a very dialectical statement right there. Like
Right.
matter, like the way that general relativity understands space is that, for one thing, it's inextricable from what we call time. Time and space, they're not separate. They're a part of a dialectical unity. Um, that mass, or what we call solid stuff, right? Stars, planets, and so on. It actually distorts space-time around it. Um, that what we understand, what we used to understand as like Newtonian motion, mutual attraction between massive objects, actually not about that at all. That was Newtonian mechanics conceives of it as in terms of things being attracted to each other via a gravitational force. In the Einsteinian paradigm, uh, mass distorts space around it, and mass actually simply just follows the shortest path along that distorted space-time, which gives us the illusion that um, things are exerting forces on each other. But in fact, this is not the case at all. They're affecting space, all space around them, and that is a profound thing. That means
Yeah.
that every piece of matter exerts an influence. I wouldn't say a force. It exerts an influence on all other matter. That is profoundly dialectical.
That
Um,
that is, I was going to ask you that. That's sort of, I think, when you understand, dialectics, at least how we think of it, is sort of a conceptual thing. Even within like the Marxist notion of dialectical materialism, we still only like grasp that conceptually. If I think that when you get into, you said that's profound. I think that's like almost beyond profound, if you ask me. Especially that like there were, I mean, again, dialectics sort of has kind of existed since like the Greeks, but again more in an idealistic sense and in an idea. But then like the material scientific approach to it, like the fact that that was even like talked about in the 1800s is wild to me.
yeah, and Engels points this in again something of I will tell people to read Dialectics of Nature like over and over again. It's so
Mm-hmm.
good. But one thing he points out is that there is a sense in which Greek dialecticians actually had something that was then lost from the history of philosophy and science, which is to say that was that notion of eternal change, eternal transformation. Everything comes so.
Yeah, that's what
Um,
in the beginning of socialism, utopian and scientific, I think like literally the beginning remark is that and I think Engels was talking a little bit about revolution per se, like more specifically, but
yeah,
talked a lot about how philosophy up until this point has been good. There's like good things, but there's been one missing key, and yeah.
right. And I think there's something to kind of borrow from Hegel here, which is that when the kind of the motion of history, you know, you know, negates and raises up Aufheben, right? Uh, it transforms through negation. What is lost is it's not always that what is lost is necessarily a thing, right? Like the thing that we lose, sometimes we lose things that through that motion that are actually very valuable. And I think that that's actually something that's present in Engels' Dialectics of Nature when he's talking about the history of scientific philosophy, which is that when we moved away from the Greek uh, paradigm of philosophy of science, that there actually something that was kind of lost for a long time, and was that dialectical interconnected nature, and that what replaced it, again according to Engels, is this kind of static metaphysical, um, everything is as it always has been.
Right, yeah,
Um,
and I think Engels uses specifically the terminology of Lockean metaphysics for that.
yes, yes,
Mhm.
exactly.
Yeah, no,
Um,
that's and
and
I,
what I wanted kind
mhm.
of sorry, what I kind of wanted to point out before it escaped my mind is
Sure.
that this is simultaneously kind of what I think is so powerful about materialist dialectics, as described in Dialectics of Nature, but it also kind of indicates to me one of its potential limits, or kind of, it's not limits exactly, but like potential tripping points, which are that I think that dialectics in that sense are, they're a very adequate, they're a much more adequate metaphor. I think dialectics are, we are still talking about human language. We're talking, I think that we should not confuse the symbolic for the ontological in that way. Like, I know this maybe
Mhm.
getting a little bit too off track, but like when we're creating these abstractions that we know as science, even if we think they are an accurate reflection of ontological facts, there's always that, as Zizek would put it, the indivisible remainder. There's always that kind of Lovecraftian unknown outside,
Right.
which we can't even. It's inassimilable to this kind of dialectical conception, I think. But that being said, I still think dialectics is, um, unless I'm able to develop something, some Aufheben from that,
Mhm.
I don't think I have a better answer to, the metaphysical problem, other than to say that I think that dialectics, materialist dialectics in the Engelsian sense, deployed in Dialectics of Nature, is kind of the best thing we have so far.
And like I think, well, so no, that's probably right in a lot of ways. I know there is sort of, I haven't approached this yet. This is the field of theory that I haven't quite hit yet. I will hit hopefully soon, but there is sort of a later 20th century response to actual core dialectics. I can't even remotely speak on it, but one thing that I have really, like, really diving into like dialectics is that at least what I think in our interactive world, in our reality, our institutions don't even get close to reflecting even a dialectical mode of like like setup or like reasoning, if that makes sense. Everything still, including like language, like linguistically, everything seems to be reflective of, again, this Lockean metaphysics, or these and some people would argue the right term to put it is Lockean substances, like substances that are separate from one another.
Well,
And yeah,
especially language is caught up in this like subject object dualism, because that's what
yes.
we use language for. right?
Yes. Yeah, no, that's it. That's exactly right. And that's something that that's something why I think like dialectics, even if we're not quite there, like if dialectics is at this point, we can go past it. Um, that's fine. That's perfect. We should try to do that. But also too, we haven't even gotten to a point where we have moved past like sort of Anglo, sort of like old English Enlightenment philosophy. Like that's why I try to point out to a lot of people, again, going back a little bit to our discussion about like theory being elitist and not useful and stuff. Well,
Sure.
there's something about philosophy and theory in my mind that is inherently more radical than just sort of the contemporary discussion of politics. It will always be so because what philosophy and theory does is it examines frameworks, and when you examine those frameworks, you understand really quick that like I don't even think our institutions represent anything past Kant. Or no, not even, we don't even represent Kant.
We
Everything.
haven't
Yeah,
gotten that far. But
yeah.
here's where I bring a really critical point that I think that that it's kind of implicit in what you brought up, which is the current like world historical moment and the geopolitical kind of alignment of power is still fundamentally this, uh, you know, Euro Anglo American hegemony,
Hmm.
right? That's that's what, for lack of better words, that is the new world order. That
Hmm.
is the global hegemony. The global hegemony is, capital, is white supremacy, is colonialism. In that sense, I don't think we've progressed past 1500.
150%.
And that's why, and I'll recommend this to everyone, is Gerald Horne's duology or trilogy, depending on how you want to think about it. There's three books by the Black Marxist scholar Gerald Horne. There's The Dawning of the Apocalypse, The Apocalypse of Settler Colonialism, and The Counter-Revolution of 1776. I think
Gotcha.
those, despite being very historical works, I think they're absolutely integral to doing philosophy in this current like world historical moment, because there's all these, and as post-colonial scholars have pointed out for some time now, there's this kind of, the implicit frame is deeply, deeply Eurocentric, both from kind of a like, determining what kind of are the driving forces of history and yada yada. Like it's all kind of right. It's written in the language of conquerors and colonizers, and that's not to say that it's just ipso facto wrong, but that's kind of the emerging from that as kind of the world historical moment that's like shaping contemporary geopolitics and world economy and so on. Um, like that, it fundamentally kind of is that it's the implicit frame that we have to continually challenge and keep excavating, and it's not just, and again, like it's not to say that's all bad, we should just throw it all into the garbage can
Of
because it's
course.
all white supremacist trash, right?
Hmm.
Like we should still read Kant, even though Kant was a racist bastard, right? We should still read Locke. We should, like, again, that's not the point that's being made. The point that's being made is that you know the state of all of those things is, again, we can keep coming back to this notion, is deeply interconnected.
Right. I was going to ask you, so those books, I'm very much interested in this as well. You do not have to type it out now. I'm very interested. If you want to send me those books, I will put them in the description of this stream for anyone who wants to watch in VOD
I
form.
will, yeah, I will send you links to them. I might even have PDFs. Um,
Perfect. Okay.
but you should actually buy them from Monthly Review Press, because one, Monthly Review Press is amazing. They're one of the longest running Anglophone socialist publications. I think they were founded in like 1947 or something. And two, they're still putting out amazing new Marxist scholarship from people like Gerald Horne, John Bellamy Foster, Kohei Saito, and other. They're very. I think they have a very solid selection of, especially like eco-Marxist sort of thinkers.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, very, and again, they have that very strong Engels influence that uh, I'm greatly adoring of.
Yeah, absolutely. Um,
But
yeah.
yeah, so it kind of gets back to our point that that uh, right? Like history, philosophy, these are all, interconnected things that we can't just kind of silo off into their own little cubby holes.
Right, and that's sort of again, I think a lot of people have recognized that it's such a big problem in even academia. Like, look at academia, like the
Oh,
fact that
right.
there's
It's not
even
like it's set up.
yeah, like
Like
the idea that even like a philosophy.
over here, your sociology department's on the other side of the building, and your physics department is on the other side of the campus, and nary the three shall meet.
Exactly. Like I see almost a using Marxian language like an almost division of labor in that setup as well, where you have and it pits it quite. I think that's one of the most again. I'm critical a lot about how um I'm critical about a lot of how Marxism has sort of developed in a sense, but there's so many like just core good, amazing. I think what was it? I think Times put like Marx. I'm very much against the worship of any like thinker. I think Times put him at like the number third smartest thinker in the world. I think that's probably right. Like like but the one that it's so
I put Engels above him.
did they? Yeah, no, that's probably that no, that's probably completely yeah, that's probably completely accurate. But one of the most goddamn like the simple idea of something like the division of labor within like modernity is so impressive to me because it's so applicable to so many things. Like again, like academia, like you have these different departments and what they necessarily do. The consequence, sorry, of this is just it's competition. And
Right.
even at the most core, like
Production of,
metaphysical,
like novelty and shit.
exactly. I think that's there's not a lot of singular things like I can think of concepts or things that I'm very much diametrically opposed to. But competition, I think, in my mind, is just the very abstract idea. It's sort of implementation in reality. I don't like it in almost any sense. Like it doesn't seem like it's actually one
Yeah.
doing what it wants to do, right? Like the idea behind just an abstract notion of competition isn't like just competition for competition's sake. It's for a winner. It's for the best to beat the best. It's for progress in a way.
It's a zero-sum game.
Exactly, and there's almost a sort of weird dialectical tonality to it, but nonetheless, no, in a sort of reverse sense, but nonetheless, like
Dialectics and then the bad infinity sense.
exactly, yeah, and but it's so I think there's such a
$1 for every time you made my brain slightly
sorry,
bigger and juicier with philosophy smile.
I apologize. I got a notification. Thank you so much for the tip, my friend, anonymous. Thank you so much. But I was gonna say it's just it's wild that it's wild that we haven't been as critical as of concepts such as like competition. Like it's
Right.
it makes sense. It's so reflective of our economic order. It's so reflective of it's so much farther beyond economic orders. It's something I'm a little bit critical about with again how we sort of approach theory or even like radical politics. Is it seems to sort of sometimes exist only within a socioeconomic plane, which is like very much more critical than how we approach a lot of things. That's wonderful, but it almost goes
Right.
beyond that, right?
And to put it in dialectical terms, like and for me explicitly in Maoist terms, it's like there is a difference within kind of the Maoist language between antagonistic and non-antagonistic contradictions, right? And that so frequently the mode in which we are approaching we approach all contradictions as inherently antagonistic contradictions, like you were saying. I think that puts it in sort of that framework that these things, like they don't need to be elevated to this, like the stakes don't need to be that high. There's no reason for it other than to reinforce the existing kind of hegemonic social structure, right? Competition is the essence of that. It's the essence of antagonistic contradiction, right? Whereas just things that like contradict, like everything moves through, as we were talking, everything moves through contradiction if we're taking dialectics at its serious, taking dialectics seriously. Everything moves through contradiction, including things that are not necessarily antagonistic. I hope the inflection of Maoist terminology didn't throw anybody for a loop, but I'm happy to kind of engage with that and keep talking about it if you're into it.
Sure. I actually Mao is sort of where that's a little bit of the off point where I've I mean, I know like a lot about sort of like Mao's thought on things, but I haven't actually read Mao. I've read Lenin, I've read Marx, I've read Althusser, I've read
Oh,
some
that's great.
yeah, Althusser was one of the first. He was one of the very first sort of theorists within like I want to say maybe 20th century or like maybe like Marxism past Marx and Engels that I actually read, but it was a very long time ago.
Yeah, Marxism anyway.
Right.
Yeah.
But yeah, I haven't quite really made it to Mao, but I've read about Mao.
I
So.
think Mao, it's again, I don't go around calling myself a Maoist or anything, but I think
Hmm.
he's absolutely integral to read, because, especially because of, again, the Eurocentrism that is so rife in Western Marxism,
Hmm.
right? And there's kind of a really kind of nasty racist like Orientalism that's attached to like, oh, well, Mao and China isn't real socialism and blah, 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 and totalitarianism, you know, 20 billion dead, blah blah blah. You know this,
Yeah,
all of the right.
of course.
Uh,
Yeah.
but and it's again, it's not to say I think Mao was right about everything. Just again, he's just a very interesting theorist who had this tremendous influence, and I think Mao is especially important to the kind of present like the biggest class struggles in the United States right now, which are centered on police violence against black and brown people, because Maoist Marxism, Mao inflected Marxism is very centered on the so-called national question,
Oh yeah.
self-determination of colonized peoples. And I think that right, like we have to think about, okay, what is America? America is a modern colony. It is still
Hmm.
colonial. We think of the colonial era as something that's bygone, but
Yeah.
America is still very much a colonial nation. And so the importance of Maoist political thought, I would say, is not so much, uh, Mao wrote the ascended galaxy brain Marxism, and we should all just follow Mao because he's the best, but
Hmm.
because of the relevance of certain sort of theoretical questions that he both posed in his writings and in his practice. Um,
Sorry, you there? I think you're cutting out.
oh no,
Oh, okay.
sorry.
Okay, no, that's okay. No, yeah, I think whenever so you said that there's a lot of like actual core new organizations that are pretty firmly entrenched, Marxist organizations at that are
Yeah.
entrenched in the Maoist camp. Yeah.
Well, and again, I like to be very careful with my language around that, because
Right.
they're not necessarily self-described. Yes, we are an explicitly MLM
Correct.
group,
Yeah.
but like for me anyway, it's very difficult to look at thinkers like Huey Newton and Bobby Seale and the Black Panthers and not be like, oh,
Oh,
these guys clearly weren't influenced by Mao. Like
sure.
they obviously were. They all read Mao. They all carried the little red book. Do they all call themselves Maoists? No, they called themselves, intercommunalists. They called themselves, black nationalists, et cetera, et cetera. Some of them called themselves explicitly Marxist-Leninists, but that's again a little beside the point.
Hmm.
The point isn't necessarily what they went around with badges on that said, "We are the Marxist-Leninist Maoist, self-determination party of Chicago," or whatever.
Right.
It's because they applied, the innovations of questions posed by those thinkers and their, that big, world historical moment, um, of China being, especially the colonial situation,
Right.
overthrowing the colonial legacy and ascending to the world stage. It's this incredible world historical moment that I think is again drastically underrated, partially due to anti-communism and Orientalism,
Right.
which is why I think we really need to give non-Western Marxists and other non-Marxist revolutionaries.
Well, especially if you're really you're very concerned with revolution, especially like because there hasn't really been a completely, like, I want to say, like, core theoretical tonality to revolution in a Western sense, like we've seen in sort of the East or even the global South and stuff like that. But I suppose we can, there's some questions there that we could dive into. I'm really careful about these questions, but and typically I don't like to talk about these, but
You're not a you know.
no, no, no,
We can,
no, no. It's totally fine. No, I no, I'd like to. That's perfectly fine.
because we're also getting into territory that I don't know very well. I know a lot
Okay.
of stuff only very obliquely, but I'll
No,
talk about the extent I'm comfortable doing.
there's one of the emerging things that I see is again I explicitly sort of separated the if you're interested in revolution or like a revolutionary tonality towards Marxism, I am not only careful about talking about it, but two, like I'm careful about I'm very cautious and almost I want to say skeptical. Well, not maybe skeptical is not the right word. Like I'm not trying to say too much, but like no, I'm almost always sympathetic to any like revolutionary endeavor that is in an explicit Marxist tonality. But that is seems to be a big theoretical or like a organizational question is like revolution. Like, do we do that?
Revolution, the debate.
Yeah, exactly. And I probably get in trouble. I'm very very cautious about the idea of like complete revolution. There's so many things there that I see there's almost a very like huge positivity and almost like I want to say for a lot of people a fetish of like revolution, and in some ways it can kind of turn into a fetish of violence.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't agree with that. I'll let you have some commentary on that because I am definitely self-proclaimed revolutionary, and I will literally die on that hill. And so I think maybe I can expound on that a little bit,
Hmm.
which is that again, when we study revolutions, we're not talking about revolutions are almost very rarely a single day of a bloody coup and a big
Of course.
mass strike or whatever, right? Like the Bolshevik Revolution, right? The model of Marxist revolution par excellence was not achieved on October 25th, 1917, right? It was literal decades of struggle that formed the theory and praxis of Bolshevism that enabled Bolsheviks to seize power, right? So revolution again is not this singular day of glorious banner raising and putting the cops against the wall and
Uh,
blah blah blah,
I
right?
that's a lot of where I get irritated with a sort of, and I'm sure you have probably felt this, but a sort of fetish of Marxism via like a violent lens. I really quite hate that.
Right,
I've
well,
seen a lot of online stuff like this person gets the wall. This does. I've seen even on like r slash communism. R slash commun. I saw a meme that said postmodernists get the wall first. Like the fuck. Like
uh,
what?
come on, right?
Yeah.
Like, well, here's the thing, like I think my basic attitude as a revolutionary, the society that we live in is already deeply, deeply violent, right?
Yeah.
And and so I think that right, and the issue of fetishism and right, we don't want to raise tactics to the level of strategy, right?
For sure.
And for example, like one thing that the Bolsheviks in their course of their history actually avoided was what was called terror, political
Hmm.
terror. They were, and the word terror in Russian specifically connotes targeted political assassinations. So
Right.
there's just context there. But they very specifically, unlike, um, the Narodniki, the populists, they did not do, we're not going to go shoot the cops. We're not going to go, assassinate the czar, right?
Hmm.
Because that doesn't change the system, right? You can kill one monarch and his son will replace him,
Sure.
right? Or you can just put the police chief against the wall, and then his lieutenant will replace him, right?
For
The
sure.
problem is not the king, the problem is the throne, right?
Correct.
And so, doing this, like, violence is I think an inevitable outcome, and I think that we should, in terms of our tactics within the greater revolutionary strategy, we should not be dogmatically committed to so-called nonviolence as
Sure.
I think that is the current fetish writ large, is this fetish of, oh, we're just going to march around with our signs.
Right. And not only that, like authority too, angles on authority, stuff like that.
Right.
There's
So many kind of just dead end conversations that are particularly relevant, but specifically with regard to violence, right?
correct.
We can't. Personally, as a trans woman, I refuse to not to rule out violent means self-defense of not only my person but also of my other trans siblings and our community, which is we are very much under attack, right?
Absolutely.
And so I think that uh, I think we need to be very careful about framing this term of violence, and that I think the stick is, to use some Leninist terminology, the stick is very much bent in the direction of this fetish of nonviolence. That I understand why some people are inclined to inflect their political rhetoric with, so and so gets the wall, and I do it sometimes. I'll admit it, but
Sure.
Here's the thing, though, is that, in my opinion, is a natural dialectical response to this overbearing hegemony of nonviolence as political fetish, right?
Yeah.
We're gonna march our signs, and we're going to all vote Democrat in November, right?
Right.
That's that's the reigning political model, and that's what I think we need to absolutely get away from. And that revolutionary struggle, again, is not
Right. I think
in a single night, but doing the hard work of building power outside of capital and the state that will allow us as workers, as colonized people, and so on, to be able to really change the world for the better, and break off the shackles of colonialism and settlerism and capitalism, which is a worldwide problem, as I stated earlier.
Right. So one of the things I'm actually more than happy to discuss something like this with you. I don't think random people on the internet, this would be anything but alienating. But one of the things that one of the problems that I see with just even a conception right now in our current, again, Marxist terminology, world historical state, maybe we could put it, is that I don't think that right now there's almost like a contention with what that sort of means in a progressive sense. So one of the things that I noticed, there's we talk about sort of the online fetish towards violence, and that's nothing explicitly Marxist whatsoever. Rather, it's just sort of a simulacrum of Marxism. Nonetheless, a simulacrum of Marxism that a lot of like right wingers tout, right? Like, look at these violent fucking communists and shit like that. But one of the things that I do see is that I almost would be a little bit worried at our current point with how sort of human relationships still is I guess integral, right? Like, again, we still live in a very competitive way. I think that, again, there's a lot of other deeper psychological or matter of fact, probably more sociological questions that haven't really been contended with. One of the things, and this really sparked up in my mind when I was reading, I wasn't doing this purposely, I was just curious. I started reading like the sort of manifestos of a lot of like communist parties, like actual core communist parties, and that were in the United States from like the 60s on to like the 80s. I read one in Canada that's still going today. I think it's a Maoist organization. And one of the things, they all said something, and they virtually all the same in almost all of the manifestos, that I noticed was actually like kind of a problem, and it was wrong. in a specific sort of way that doesn't get talked about a lot. And they all claimed, and this is almost a tragedy if you ask me,
Okay.
they all claimed that workers, we represent what workers actually want. And now that should be the case, right? It should. Like a Maoist organization or a communist organization should absolutely represent what, and their approach isn't necessarily wrong. It's like almost our indoctrinated workers. Yeah, exactly. And
there's this tendency to confuse aspiration for actuality.
Sure, and well, sure, even in like an analytical, like philosophical sense. But two, I noticed like the one question we actually haven't well, we have historically, but one that still even today, in like 21st century sort of global neoliberalism is like, why the fuck? Why do people not only like are happy to live with their chains and do what they do, but why hasn't anyone, or like why do they defend it? Like why, like these are questions that sometimes I think, yeah,
it makes me think of that, just to be I don't care how much hate it gets, I will defend the Matrix to the day I die.
Matrix is great.
Shout out to my trans sisters, Lana and Lily Wachkowski. Awesome. Anyway, it just reminds me of that scene where Morpheus and Neo go back into the Matrix for the first time after he's been unplugged, and this is very, the very anti-capitalist text. I mean, not even subtext text of this movie, which is, he says, "You look around you, what do you see? Doctors, lawyers, people who are so inured to the system that they would fight to protect it." Like, there, you cannot get any more explicit in terms of the critique of, of what you're just talking about, in terms of people who are so wrapped up in capitalist life that they would literally, they trip over themselves to say that it's good.
Right. Mm-hmm. And that's that in my mind is incredibly important, and that doesn't get talked about enough, really. And I think that if there is going to, because again, sometimes it can be, we can absolutely recognize a lot of it. I mean, for fuck's sakes, like we have like climate change is arguably probably at this point going to kill us all. I mean, that's as much material, like evidence of something like, say, revolution, or necessity that you can get. But I'm almost extremely wary about sort of the immediate detrimental effects, because we sometimes can forget like a revolution like that is such a serious thing, and
Right.
it will operate in a way that is radically different and probably far more bloody and violent than we've ever seen in the past.
I don't disagree.
Absolutely. And I think that at least one of the main sort of the sort of main skepticism that I have is, at least I want to see a almost mainstream attempt to try to find and answer those questions, in a more 21st century context.
Sure. And I guess the retort that I would put forward is that I think we are long past that time. I think that the people who are in power and the people who could be in power within the existing political structures are completely inadequate to the task, whatever their stated intentions may be. And that, again, I think that with this issue of, particularly in the United States, but also just kind of in whatever you want to call the Western Euro-American civilization in general, is that the primary contradiction, and again, I'm using terminology, so feel free to ask me to clarify. The primary contradiction is white supremacy. White supremacy gives white workers buy-in, literally gives them buy-in, and creates this, like the labor aristocracy, as Lenin put it, and as kind of Du Bois put it, that that white workers, white proletarians, receive literal wages of whiteness, right? Not psychological as well, but also material. We're talking about people, white workers getting disproportionately placed into higher paying jobs, for sure. Access to professional jobs that are high paid, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And and then of course negative privileges such as not getting arrested, not getting a longer prison sentence, getting shot or brutalized by the cops at the same levels as colonized folks. So I think that when approaching this, like, how do we throw off these capitalistic chains, I think that we need to view it through the lens of racial capitalism, as I think Cedric Robinson and I think more contemporarily Ruth Wilson Gilmore put it. That again, like people keep asking, oh well, why don't Americans revolt or whatever? It's like, oh, okay, for one thing, look outside,
Right.
because see, there are, whether you want to call it revolution or not, this is certainly a revolutionary adjective moment in terms of Black self-determination and protests against police violence and so on, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Right.
I think that those, in the American situation at least, are far more integral to understanding why aren't we progressing past this stagnant stage of neoliberal hegemony on the one hand, and reluctance to do even the most basic measures to prevent catastrophic things like climate change that even the bourgeoisie is thoroughly aware are real things, right?
100%.
Right, they know they're buying, the bourgeoisie are doing their doomsday prepper shit, right?
100%. Well, and that's,
so it's not as if they don't know it's a problem. They know it's a problem. They have no intention of helping solve it because
100%.
they think they can get away with it, right? They've been in power. This is and I would say this is something that differentiates the Euro-American, especially American bourgeoisie, from the rest of the kind of historical bourgeoisie, is that unlike those bourgeoisies, the American bourgeoisie is a very developed class, is a highly developed class that whose roots and power structures are much deeper rooted because their hegemony was cemented from the day that colonists stamped into the North American soil.
right.
So qualitatively, their hegemony, I would say, is much harder to break, and part of that is kind of the greater white supremacist power structures that are endemic to the way that capital is structured here.
For sure. I think right. No, everything you said, we have an entire class and essentially ruling class that is absolutely not up for the task, and they don't even want to be up for the task for even trying to curtail something like this. That's absolutely true. But the thing that really, and this sucks, like, again, this is sort of a tragedy within itself, that like it almost still doesn't negate a lot of the severity in my mind of something like a very bloody revolution that we've talked, so that gets talked about. So one of the things that I learned, I was actually, I can't remember what class was this. This is actually I think I did this for a political science class. I'm a political science and history major, but I wrote an entire thing about sort of like in history about like sort of the Civil War. I wrote like a paper, but then I started stumbling across, and this is not related to what I was necessarily writing about, but what would like civil war or a revolution look like in a Western context. And there's a lot of things that I don't think that like a lot of us are really familiar with. If there was a civil war or a revolution in today's context, it would likely starve 90% of the entire population of the United States. And it's primarily to do with how our infrastructure operates in today's world, and that's being something that sort of a complete reliance on a trucking system, on airline system, on continual
networks and the JIT
right. and
all. Yeah.
Right. Sure. And so that's something, there are some innate really big contradictions, like almost sort of psychological or sociological ones of like, okay, people don't even like, there's like, we'll see manifestos that claim like we are what the workers want. I wish almost in a way that is, but like what we see is like that's actually not. One, workers in some ways don't want it. Two, we're dealing with an entire infrastructure issue, and I understand this is a really hard thing. I'm very careful about talking about this because a lot of people are dead set on revolution, and I'm not even necessarily opposed. I'm just I'm very critical about.
Very clearly. No, I understand that.
Yeah,
I definitely have a deep appreciation for that as a revolutionary, which is that the costs are, the human cost of revolution and the human cost of continuing the status quo. And I don't like framing it in utilitarian terms like that.
right.
But, because you're literally just comparing, well, half the population will die
Sure.
due to revolution versus 98% of the population that will die if we remain in the status quo.
Of course.
Right? I don't like framing it in those terms because I think it's treating human beings as statistics, and I'm not into that.
Of course.
But yeah, no. Again, in that sense, in that kind of analytic that you just kind of went through, I think is still absolutely invaluable for revolutionaries to consider. It's
Right.
valuable for everybody to consider because, and again, what I think in terms of civil war breaking out, if revolution breaks out, it will inexorably lead to civil war. I think that civil war is an inevitability, and right, like this other thing is that so often in the history of the of capitalism, the alternative to revolution, the alternative to socialist revolution from the heart of a deadlock of a capitalist crisis is the alternative is not just capitalism, it's fascism. And I think that
Sure.
will be, and I think we've been seeing the seeds of a kind of an American style fascism on the way for at least the last 40 years.
Sure.
I think what a lot of people call neoliberalism,
Right.
I have kind of likened to a sort of what you might call like an incipient, like structural fascism, right? Because what have we seen? We've seen police budgets explode. We've
Right.
seen right to public assembly severely curtailed. We've seen voting rights continually restricted, which again, it's not to say that bourgeois democracy is, like as Lenin said, bourgeois democracy is still better than no democracy.
Sure. Exactly. Yeah.
So we've seen even these very limited bourgeois freedoms curtailed severely, and we've seen this huge escalation of the police state, prison population exploding, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think that we're seeing, and I would highly advise folks read George Jackson's. He basically in the 70s is saying that America is we're living the fascist reality now. I necessarily disagree with him,
Right.
and I think that is the fundamental problem of revolution here, which is that we can either kind of sit on our hands and hoe and hum about how many people could die, or how are we going to restructure our society, or I think the cost of remaining where we are is far too high to be conscionable. I think it's leaving things the way they are, or even trying to approach reforms. I think we are far past that point of conversation of the historical conversation. That's my argument. I'll
Right.
leave it, because I feel like I probably beat a dead horse at some
No,
point.
no. It's perfectly fine. No, yeah, no, absolutely. Like, I think what we are seeing is a very new a sort of a technocratic neo-fascism that's probably emerging. And absolutely, the structure has been completely founded on sort of weird neoliberalism that emerged in the 80s and stuff like that. But 150%. Oh, what was I? Sorry, I was actually going to bring something. This might actually relate to what we were talking about a little bit earlier about Zizek's sort of ontological incompleteness.
Yeah,
But it still has to do with revolution in some ways. I'm actually, though, I've talked to a couple people. I've actually read a little bit about what new emerging sort of quote unquote emancipatory systems past maybe initial capitalism goes. I'm not actually 150% convinced that we are at the point where, without a severe bloody revolution in the traditional Marxist-Leninist context, right? That we will lead down to like a level of authoritarian fascism that we saw like in World War II, or even worse. I'm not exactly set there. And Zizek has actually talked about this a little bit, and he says this a lot, but I think this may relate to the ontological incompleteness. But he says things happen, and there are things that don't map to our sort of like intellect, to our what our historical trajectory would be. Things happen, and there's been a lot of discussion about like what may socialism look like, and a lot of people God, I can't remember where I saw this. I think someone actually ran like number experiments, like what is the most likely outcome for like economic systems past capitalism. Well, and in a lot of ways, one of the more likely scenarios that people have pointed out is that, and I think I'm kind of here. I think it makes a lot of sense to me. Of course, we could always be wrong, but it makes a lot of sense that I think that we will see a sort of weird labor accelerationism through things like what is it? Automation. And rather than seeing a traditional sort of revolution like we saw in the past of like arms, rather the system, and ironically, this could actually theoretically be worse, but we could see like sort of a system implode within itself, and that like even in every context possible, the only possible thing we could see is a sort of workers-owned public economy that is also sort of centrally planned, if that makes sense. So it's sort of like a quasi-democratic socialism.
Right. Or, like, I think that the YouTube channel Октябрь just put a video about how Soviet democracy worked.
But yeah.
Highly recommend folks check that out, which is that I think that in terms of like post-capitalism, I think that we need to have a very open mind about it. And what I mean by that is that not necessarily it may look something like how the USSR was at various points in its history. It may look like something like Cuba or Vietnam, or there's a number of other cases of existing socialist societies, both living and past, that are worth either emulating or drawing from, and that we're talking about in terms of our like understanding of putting tools in our toolkit, right? In the way that we're talking about Deleuze earlier,
right?
I think that we shouldn't get too hung up on it, because I think that as important as it is to understand, what I think is important to understand is that these systems do exist and have existed. I think that already opens up a huge field of possibility.
Sure.
And that potentially new systems are possible within the coordinates that are available within the existing forces of production, to put it in Marxist terms. Right, and I think there's this kind of very dismissive attitude among like Western Marxists and sort of what you can call it like ultra left, or on both. It's weird. It's a tendency within both kind of ultra left tendencies and within kind of so-called democratic socialist tendencies, is, oh well, that's authoritarian, whatever. I think it's just a repackaged version of Red Scare propaganda and Orientalism, right? And it's
sure.
Again, it's say that these societies did everything right. I mean, horrible things that happened, and I'm not trying to downplay that.
Right.
However, there were things that these societies did that were absolutely worthwhile, and that
sure.
do provide us, if not with, I would not say with a blueprint for a life beyond capitalism, but certainly, some helpful hints at the very least.
Right. No. I absolutely. That's why I don't take moralistic approaches to talks of like the Soviet Union or even China or Cuba. I don't like that at all. Like it's impossible to sort of evaluate these systems in the same sort of Western moralization that we think of today.
Right. Especially because so much of the material that we have that's available is heavily, it's from publishers that get money from the Lannan Foundation and the Wallace Faction Fund and all that shit that's deeply anti-communist.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. And there's an entire, again, political economy tells us a lot of things about financial sort of situations like that. Absolutely, it's 100% correct. So yeah, no, we talked about a little bit about we went into sort of like
covered a lot already.
Yeah, emergent sort of like early theory with its relation to physics. We talked a little the basic definition of quantum physics. It is so. I think you recently mentioned to me that like sort of quantum mechanics is sort of like the basis for that ontological incompleteness that Zizek has talked about. I figured we could.
Yeah, he likes to draw on quantum mechanics to use that as kind of a framing device.
Gotcha.
For ontological incompleteness. He says, and I'm kind of loosely paraphrasing him here, he says that, something that's as bizarre as quantum mechanics seems to indicate that, what he says, again, paraphrasing, is that God designed the universe like a lazy video game developer, that, there's the trees that are on the horizon, but you can't ever, and it's just actually the skybox is there and there's nothing behind it, right? Or,
okay.
There's all these empty buildings that, they don't look empty from the outside, but if you were to pass through them, there's actually nothing there. Right. I think that using it as, I think there's kind of a helpful metaphor in terms of what quantum can tell us about how we experience the world phenomenologically, and I think that point is really well made in Zizek. But again, my problem with it is that at least from my perspective as a physicist, is that we already have at least one big kind of ontological crisis within physics, which is that, and I'm not sure how familiar you are with this, but we actually have two theories of the universe right now which are in complete radical contradiction to each other. We have, on the one hand, general relativity, which again is the unity of space and time, and like mass curving space-time around it on the one hand, right? This is a very effective theory for describing massive things, big things, the universe on this cosmic scale. It's an amazing theory for dissecting those things. And we have, on the other hand, quantum field theory and the so-called standard model, which describes quantum mechanics, the theories of the very small, right? Well, the problem with this is that QFT, quantum field theory, QFT doesn't postulate that matter transforms space-time around it. Space is an independent frame within quantum mechanics. Well, that's a problem because general relativity says that mass curves space-time.
Right.
Well, quantum mechanics doesn't. Well, that's a very big problem. And then the other problem, and again, I talked about this a little bit earlier, is that quantum mechanics says that the universe has a pixel size, right? There's some minimum quantity of energy and space that exists, right? Hence, that's literally what quantum means.
Right.
It's the minimum quantity through which everything is kind of built on. Well, general relativity is based on the notion that space is infinitely divisible. Well, that's also a big problem. So those are two big. I'd say I don't think of them as ontological problems. Those are epistemological problems. Those stem from inadequacies in our access to information about the what Kant called the Ding an sich, the thing in itself.
Right. It seems almost phenomenologically like an issue as well.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely. Right. Yeah, and there's all these things that we still the observer effect and kind of the anthropic principle. Those things are not expressly related to quantum mechanics and general relativity. However, right, like there are so many things that are just kind of constantly, at least for me as a physicist, reminding me that the universe is more Lovecraftian than Hegelian.
Sure, for sure. I don't want to cut you off. I apologize. We're running. I'm super sorry.
That's okay.
We are running a little bit short of time. I figured I would ask David asked me in chat. I apologize. Did I cut you off too early, or was there anything else that you were?
No, I said my piece, and I'm the kind of girl who if you let me keep talking, I'll never shut up.
Okay, I'm kind of like that too. No problem. David asked, and I want to answer this. He donated. Thank you so much, David. Any thoughts on France Fanon? I have not read France or Fanon.
Yeah, I've read excerpts from Wretched of the Earth. I think there are some really valuable insights into, you know, uh, problems of racism and colonialism within Fanon, but I can't. That's a very kind of almost trivial statement.
Right.
So I'd just say, go check out. I think Revolutionary Left Radio did a series, or maybe it was Red Menace. Red Menace podcast did a series on Wretched of the Earth that is definitely worth checking out. And also, speaking of Rev Left, though, I wanted to make a shameless self-plug because we were talking about Louis Althusser earlier. Sure. I actually was a guest on Rev Left Radio, and I talked about ideology and ideological state apparatuses on that show. So, a little shameless self-plug for that.
No, absolutely. No problem at all. Thank you. Thank you again for coming on. I think we'll probably wrap it up here. We could always definitely in the near future possibly do this again as well. This is a really interesting talk that I've had. I've again wanted to get people. I wanted to get people on who actually understand like the like physics, and then who are also interested in theory. And that's kind of a hard find. I'm sure, as you know.
Right. Well, my DMs are open. I'll forewarn you that I'm pretty bad at answering my Discord, but I will always answer my Twitter messages. And feel free to reach out anytime. I'm also happy to be a consulting voice on if you ever make videos in the future that need a little dose of science and
absolutely
whatever. And I'd be happy to have you. I've done some collaborations with other creators, so I'd be happy to have you on one of my videos sometime. So just feel free to reach out, and I want to also thank your audience. I think they've been really cool and interesting, and I've been looking at some of the questions floating by, and
yeah, no, absolutely. I'm kind of lucky. A lot of depending on the person, I've had a couple on here that I had to remove one message, but compared to a lot of how the internet operates, my audience is actually really, really cool and really, really calm and really like super. So I appreciate all of them.
I'm always very appreciative of when I'm on streams and I don't see a bunch of like transphobic abuse.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, cool.
Yeah.
Cool. Audience that doesn't want to burn me alive.
Good Lord. Yeah, I mean, it's not a surprise, I suppose, in some respects, although that's really bad. But I've been on some programs. The people who actually are the head of certain YouTube channels, I don't even want to put them out there. They're actually very nice, very good people, but their audience is some of the worst, horrible.
Yeah,
like
I've had some bad experiences.
Yeah,
there.
and
I was on, and this is not to talk shit here, but I was on Radical Reviewers. I did Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific with him. He's a great channel, but his audience, I would say, is disproportionately anarchist, and I think he got some shit for giving a platform to a big, mean, evil tanky like me.
I don't really. That's again. I stay so far away from any sort of terminology like tanky or.
Right. It's just political epithets, so we really don't need to give them any credence.
No, 100%. No, it's just like the idea that people would even. I don't know. I try not to be too antagonistic in any of those regards regarding ideology or anything like that.
Yeah. Just keep it chill.
Right.
Especially on the internet where there's no fucking stakes.
Yeah, I think we run into some issues where, again, sort of it's a digital simulation of things, and in simulations you can do whatever you want technically, and so yeah, shit can go wrong real quick. But I was just gonna say I seriously wanted to thank you again for coming on. I appreciate that.
No
we touch on some pretty interesting stuff and a lot of really like kind of mind-bending stuff as well. But I think I'm probably going to go ahead and head on out of the Discord. Thank you so much again for coming on here. I'll wrap it up here.
Have a great day.
Thank you. You too. Bye. All right, guys. Again, seriously, thanks so much for watching, guys. I always kind of give a similar spiel. If I'm pronouncing this name correctly, Rohit Sonon. Sorry if I butcher your name. I'm terrible with names. I apologize. I can get to that maybe on another stream if you want to. If you would like to do that, maybe next stream I could answer that question. I apologize. Typically, it's a little bit hard to answer a lot of in-depth questions on conversational like streams. If punditry is unproductive and we should prioritize educational and creative content, but grad school is a pyramid scheme, what do you recommend? Same there. I can try to answer that question. I think, Nathan, last stream you answered a question at the very, very end, and I said, ask me again. I'm super sorry. I do have to get going really soon. I'll try to give a quick two things here. What do you think pandemic's going to affect capitalism? I don't know. I immediately on the top of my head, Rohit, I do not know. Nathan, if punditry is unproductive and we should prioritize educational content, but grad school is a pyramid scheme, what do you recommend? I recommend trying to oh god, and so it's a Salvia story. I'll tell you guys that too. Probably interact, build relationships with people, try to, contend with some text, secondary text, primary text, sources. Do a little bit of like actual independent investigation on things rather than just purely outside of like an institution. Try to find a way that if you are a worker, try to find a way to, in the little free time that you have compared to work, try to take a little bit of time and just independently try to learn as much as you can and as much as you can mentally bear, I suppose. Kind of take it as sort of like a responsibility, I guess. Outside of institutions, that can be kind of hard because there's no framework to, like within a university, there's no framework to approach these things. I think something like content creation's nice for a lot of the times. It depends on the certain type of content creation, of course. But yeah, I could certainly go into these questions way more in depth later on. But again, thank you guys so much. I wanted to give another shout out to David and Anonymous. Thank you guys so much for the tips. David, you always tip every single stream. That is incredibly kind of you, dude. Thank you so much. To everyone else, if you guys do want to support monthly, I actually have a video in early access on our Patreon. Any tier on Patreon, you get early access to the video. It's still up. I'll probably take it down to schedule the video premiere at around 6 o'clock. Consider supporting on Patreon. It's how I can do like any of this. YouTube doesn't pay absolutely anything, and yeah, so it's how I do all of this. For anyone who also buys on Amazon, don't buy on Amazon because I tell you to. Rather, if you use it regardless, consider using my link. They pay me for it. It doesn't cost you anything, so that helps a little bit too. But other than that, guys, feel free to follow on socials as well at Epoch Philosophy, I think on Twitter and Instagram. But yeah, thank you guys so much for hanging out. I'm going to head on out of here.